Did I put this glove up my nose for the thumbnail shot? I did. Did I nick the inside of my nose with one of the blades? You bet your sweet bippy. Was it worth it? Yes. Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video here on the channel. Keeping with the theme of the 40th anniversary of the first Nightmare on Elm Street coming up, I'm going to be doing your hot takes on the franchise. As always, sharing some brain trust with the amazing man Cody Leach. That glorious bastard did a video on your Halloween hot takes, which was very, very cool to see. That was a damn good video. And I always love these types of videos. It's just good for discussion. And some of you guys had some pretty interesting hot takes. There were a lot of hot takes when it came to the remake and A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. Now, also, a massive thank you to everyone who so far has bought my Jack Skellington resin heads. These pieces are cast off a production-made Jack Skellington head that I've had in storage for the longest time, and I figured I'd love to make them available to people who are fans of Nightmare Before Christmas, horror, stuff like that. They come in a nice little transparent tie-up bag. I will leave the Etsy link down below. So I have 20 odd hot takes here. Again, there was a big recurring theme when it came to the remake and A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. So the first one comes from Cody Liach. Yet. No idea. I must be a new subscriber or new to the platform. My hot take is I don't want to see Robert back in the role of Freddy. Nothing but love for the man, but he's not physically able to deliver a version of the character that any of us actually want to see. And I think he'd say that himself. As much as many fans are hoping for it, a Halloween 2018 style legacy sequel with Englund and Langerkamp would be the most boring and creatively devoid thing that the franchise could possibly do. I agree. And many years ago, I did my pitch for a direct sequel to the first Elm Street, where they got Robert, where they got Heather, if they got Johnny Depp back. And I pitched the idea, and that was many moons ago. Robert is now nearly 80 years old. He's getting up there to getting 80, and he's admitted he can't do it anymore unless it was an animated version, which quite frankly, I don't want to see. But I totally am on board with this. He's done as Freddy. As sad as that is, it's one of those things where you look back and you think, look what we got. You know, each end of the spectrum in terms of the portrayal of Fred, but Robert will always be Freddy. But I think it's definitely up for interpretation with a new actor. I would want an unknown actor. I feel like having a big A-list star, well, not necessarily an A-list star, can be a bit of a distraction. Whereas you get an unknown, which at the time back in '84 was Robert. Obviously he had V going on playing Willie the Alien, but he exactly wasn't a household name back in 1984. And I agree, just physically he can't do it anymore. And the idea of a direct sequel, because it's so oversaturated these days, I think it's just done. You got to call it a day at some point. Culture 2018 says, once Freddy became a merchandising hot seller and catchphrase machine, he was no longer scary. It was more about making you laugh and selling you product than inducing fear in the viewer. I agree 100%. So much so, this coming weekend, I'm recording a video with Frank and Darren from the Slaughtered Lamb Movie Podcast in terms of the funniest Freddy moments. Like, so far removed from what started out with Part 1 Fred, Part 2 Fred, hell, even New Nightmare Fred. And it's true, it's crazy to see what Wes initially engineered and designed with the character of Freddy, just how dark and mean he was. And then by the end, with Freddy's Dead, Dream Child, Freddy's Nightmares, all the advertising stuff. And look, at the end of the day, Robert looks like he was having an absolute ball when it came to not only the films, the series, but also, you know, VHS merchandising stuff, Freddy's board game, rapping with the Fat Boys, just stuff like that. It was crazy to see how much of a merchandising machine Freddy became, to the point where they had Freddy Krueger pajamas and cuddly action figures. It was crazy to think that a child killer could get pajamas and his own toy line, like cuddly toy line for that matter. So I agree. It's fascinating to see as well, just the progression and initially what was started, because Wes never wanted his film to be a franchise. He just wanted to do a one and done. And that was it. Kane B, the best version of Freddy is in Freddy vs. Jason. Demon Freddy is badass. I agree, Demon Freddy is badass. I wanted to see more of that makeup. It's a shame it lasted like, what, 30 seconds when he's on the dock with Laurie. Just that makeup was so good. The way they blended the original makeup from Freddy vs. Jason with this demon muscled up, you know, like teeth showing through. In terms of the best version of Freddy being in Freddy vs. Jason, while I disagree with that, I will say that it was a damn good return to form. Considering timeline-wise, we're not including Wes Craven's You Nightmare. It's essentially Freddy's dead, then Freddy vs. Jason. I think it's a great return to form. He's that balance of Freddy that I'd equate to from, say, Dream Warriors. That's the way I put it. To me, part 1, part 2 Fred's always going to be the best version for me. But also, strong runner-up, definitely Freddy vs. Jason. It's that balance of dark, mean Freddy, but also that sense of humor injected into the role. Evil Alex 87, part 2 is the best sequel. Freddy is the scariest he's ever been. The bus nightmare intro is amazing. The pool party massacre, one of the best scenes in the franchise. The music and atmosphere is scary. Freddy coming out of Jesse body, one of the best practical effects in the 80s. It's funny. I now put Elm Street 2 over Elm Street 3. I'd always go back and forth between Elm Street 1 and 3, but now I have just such a love and care for part 2. Clearly, I'm wearing the part 2 glove. But it has a lot of good going for it. I'm glad to see it's renaissanced in a way. Even like all the homoerotic stuff in it, like given the time it was made, a scary time for people that were unsure of their sexuality, it kind of works. It kind of works with not knowing what's going on inside of you and then it bursts out. But just the scene of Freddy coming out of Jesse, the effects by Mark Shostrom and his crew, the bus opening sequence, I agree, that is proper nightmare fuel at its finest. Freddy is dark and mean. That makeup by Kevin Yeager is demonic. I mean, like, Christ, look at this shot right here. That is one of the most horrific shots in the entire franchise. Brendan Collins 5012. Robert Englund perfected the performance in part 2. Exact right balance of cheeky and sadistic. Best Freddy performance of the franchise in my opinion. I actually think, dude, he has minimal humor in part 2. I feel like part 1 Fred has more cheeky humor than part 2 Fred. Like, you know, he cracks a few jokes and he's cheeky, he's sadistic in part 1. Part 2, he barely like really cracks a joke. It's you know, you've got the body, I've got the brain, but there's no real joke there. And it's that sadistic cackle when his brain's exposed and Jesse's screaming. So I think he's a bit darker than part 1 Fred, which says a lot because for the longest time, I always thought part 1 Fred was the most evil. But when you think about it comparatively, Freddy from part 1 jokes more than Freddy from part 2. Red Hood 3 Jokers 1399. The Freddy makeup looks like Pizza the Hit from Spaceballs in some movies. Funny enough, I don't know if this is embellished or what, but David Miller got inspiration for Freddy's makeup for part 1 from a pizza. Just the way the pepperoni sat and the cheese around it, and he was looking at it and he took it home, and how weird it would be if he took a mold of it. But that's where he got the idea of like the open sores and all that. But the makeup had its ups and downs. I think for me, part 1 and part 2, that makeup is just brilliant. Part 3 and 4 are very similar. It's a very thin makeup. And then by, you know, with part 4, Kevin Yeager kind of went back to part 2. That's what he'd said anyway. And then 5 and 6, it's very healed. It looks like he's healing back into Robert Englund. It's not as detailed, especially when it comes to the paintwork, the paint app and stuff like that. I don't know if they just did that to fast track it. But definitely for part 1, it's like Pizza Face. Wienertroner, if you want to do Freddy right, you gotta do it like the channel at Unknowingly via Analog Horror. Keep Fred in the shadows with no dialogue and only see a glimpse of his silhouette. I agree, and that's pretty much akin to like part 1 and 2. Keeping Freddy in the shadows, just relying on how that makeup glistens and reflects the light, and you can see Robert's beady eyes, and also having his dialogue be minimal. Like his dialogue in part 1 was minimal compared to part 2. He spoke a bit more, he got more vocal, as cinematographer Jacques Haken said. There definitely was a bit more of the sense of humor in part 1, but also just relying on Robert's grin and those rotten teeth and his beady eyes and the light picking that up and the glistening of all those sores, keeping him a mystery. Like the less you know about the monster, That's more horrifying to me. Jason Lives, 1986. The razors attached to Freddy's hand in part 2 is my favorite version of Freddy's glove. Freddy vs. Jason is my second favorite glove. Okay, I don't know what you'd call that from part 2. I call it like the meaty blade hands where the blades grow out of the actual hand and it's all burnt and everything. And like, this is the part 2 glove, even though this is carried over from part 1. I love this one the most. Like, it was always like a toss-up between how it looked in part 1 or part 2, and I think just part 2, it's just so grungy and grimy by the time they got around to making part 2. But the Verse Glove is impressive. Again, like the characterization of Freddy in Freddy vs. Jason, it was a decent return to form. It was impressive, and it's a weighty glove too. Like those big ass blades and just how kind of stubby and almost medieval it looks, like with the stubby back plate, and it's got that weird drawstring with washers on it. It's still an impressive looking glove. So, and it just makes sense that you need something heavy duty to go up against Jason. WR8NG, Rang? Let's call you Rang. I feel like the best version of Freddy we see has to be from Dream Warriors. He still has the horror to him, but this is when we really start seeing his comedic side. If they kept this tone of Freddy for the rest of the franchise, the last 3 movies would have been a slight improvement. I definitely agree that Dream Warriors Freddy is that balance of cruel, mean, dark Freddy, and then having that added sense of humor, the quips, the one-liners, but they're not too in your face. Like, obviously we have What's Wrong Joey feeling tongue-tied, stuff like that, you know, Let Him Go Kruger, your wish is my command, just being an absolute smartass, but not too in your face, but at the same time being cruel, like when he cuts Philip's, you know, arms and feet open and gets the tendons out and marionettes him. That's like cruel, sadistic Freddy, you know, taking a hobby that you love and throwing it in your face and have it ultimately be the death of you. I agree. It's a pretty good balance when it comes to the characterization of, like, I want to call it final form Fred. Christoph Video Productions. The trench coat for Freddy should have had more appearances through the series. The hat and the sweater are iconic, but the overcoat always really added something to Freddy's look that I loved. Didn't have to be on all the time, but I would have loved it if it was worn more. I agree, and there are those promo stills from Dream Warriors that I think Darren from the Slaughtered Lamb said were only in the UK. I don't really remember the VHS having the trench coat look, but they did promo stills and they put like this big heavy duty tweed wool trench coat on Robert, and it works. The trench coat originated from when Wes saw this drunk homeless man as a child, looked out the window and he had the fedora on and a trench coat and just looked dark, ominous, mysterious and stuff like that. I would have loved to have seen a dirty soiled trench coat in part 1. And I've always said when it came to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, as much as I dig that look, I would have loved to have seen the part 1 Fred look in New Nightmare with a trench coat, but just looking absolutely filthy. Like, he looks filthy in part 1, but more filthy because time had passed. It's been like 10 years, like pieces of flesh are falling off, teeth, stuff like that being exposed, the sweater's more rotted, and like having this rotted trench coat. I feel like he was way too clean in New Nightmare, even though it's an interesting design. But yeah, I definitely would have loved to have seen the trench coat make more of an appearance throughout the franchise. And there are like the promo stills of Freddy from part 4 wearing a trench coat, where I don't think that's a trench coat. I think that's a leather jacket that they just threw on Robert. But it does cast a neat silhouette, very much like Nosferatu. Joe Flablots. My hot take is that the remake isn't that bad. With better CGI and had most of the deleted scenes being kept, it honestly would have made for a great movie. Yeah, even though it's usually at the bottom of my list, there are redeeming qualities to it. Mostly Jackie Earle Haley. It wasn't his fault he didn't exactly portray the best iteration of Fred. That comes down to the writing. And also I think that makeup was holding him back, even though I get what they were going for with the realistic burn look. You lose Jackie's performance in that restrictive makeup, whereas with Robert, they relied on Robert's mannerisms, his eyes, you know, his grin and stuff like that. And it's funny, the deleted scenes, it's one of those ones where I'm like, why did you do that? Like, they're, you know, few and far between in terms of seeing them in decent quality. But there are a lot of those scenes where I'm like, it just would have made sense to keep those particular shots, sequences and stuff like that in there to kind of pad things out and have things make a bit more sense. I like the inclusion of the micro naps and stuff like that. The dream sequences are interesting now and then, especially when Nancy's in the pharmacy and it flashes back and forth from the boiler room to the aisle of the pharmacy. And all the stocks coming off as Freddy's slicing it, and you know, he's like hitting the pipe and stuff like that. That's interesting to me. The idea that Fred could have possibly been an innocent man and they followed through with that, and these kids just dobbed him in for the sake of it, and they've killed an innocent man. Fuck, that just makes his revenge quest all the more fucked up and just makes sense. But also when they made him a pedophile, I was like, oh, you went a bit too dark. You can't exactly root for a predator. You just picture Chris Hansen walking in. What are you doing? I have the transcript. Monday Worship 390. Robert Englund was Freddy. Robert Englund is Freddy. I think that this is one of those characters where the actor is the reason why the character works so well. They're forever linked. No other actor could be Freddy. You'd have to tweak the character too much. Look what happened with the reboot. You can't just stick any old actor in a battered fedora and makeup. Won't work. Didn't work. While I agree Robert will always be Freddy, and I think it could have gone another way had another actor have come into the role. Like Wes was looking at stuntmen, older men, stuff like that. But then Robert, who was 36, I'm 36 next month. It baffles me that I'm nearly the same age Robert was when he played Freddy in part 1. Like, fuck. I think because he's classically trained and the physicality and stuff like that, it definitely added just all these beautiful layers to the character. And Wes was probably like, holy shit, this turned out better than I had anticipated. And going back to Cody Leach's hot take where, you know, a direct sequel wouldn't work, you definitely need another actor. I think so, but I think an unnamed actor. Otherwise, a household name, an A-lister would be way too much of a distraction. You know, there was always the murmurs of, you know, wanting Kevin Bacon, Billy Bob Thornton. I think, and someone mentioned it before, Walter Goggins would make an interesting Freddy, but he's so mainstream now because of Fallout. It could definitely be a distraction. But I think you have to kind of always have that attitude of never say never. Like, always leave it up to interpretation. And surely they definitely can't make a carbon copy of what Robert's Freddy was. You'd have to do something different. And yes, they did try that in 2010. And while it didn't exactly work out, at least they gave it a crack. Renee19878, the ending to A Nightmare on Elm Street was horrible and probably one of the worst movie endings of all time. Love the movies, but hated the ending. I couldn't agree more. It's such a whimper of an ending. Like, it goes out on a whimper considering how good the rest of part 1 is. And they obviously shot those 3 endings where Nancy goes off, everything's hunky-dory. Then they shot the sequence where the car gets taken over, they drive off, Marge gets sucked, well, a blow-up doll gets sucked into the door of 1428 Elm. And then that other one where Freddy is indeed driving the car. I like the one where Freddy's driving the car, or a red herring where Nancy wakes up in her bed after that, where it's halfway through that sequence, she wakes up and Freddy could pop out and get her, and then it cuts to black. But there was a lot of tension between Wes Craven, Bob Shaye, because Wes, again, didn't want this to be a franchise. He just wanted to, you know, call it a day, and that's it. Just the story of Fred in one movie. Bob Shaye saw dollar signs, sequel potential, franchise potential, so that's why they had all those sequences filmed for the end, and, you know, some were kit bashed and stuff like that. I definitely like the one of Freddy driving the car. Kind of just makes sense, but it is very hokey with that blow-up doll being sucked into the door of 1428. I just realized there's another one from Red Hood 3 Jokers 1399, you cheeky bastard. You got 2 in here. Freddy's voice is something I was never a fan of. It depends. Like, the voice modulation in part 1 and 2, really good. Really, really good. And if you haven't seen it, there is a clip on YouTube of them playing with the voice modulation from part 1. And it's really interesting to see that they were going for echoes at some point. But I really think just how pitched down it is in part 1 and 2, it's great.
No, you die.
But then, like, by part 6, it's like,
it's traveling time.
But then when you hear Robert's unmodulated voice, it sounds painful for him. Like, holy shit. Like, he must have put not only his skin through the ringer, but his vocal cords as well. Chef Matt Reviews. This is a big one. Hot take. Much as Robert has cemented his performance into the annals of horror history. I read that as anals. I think if we were to get a new Nightmare film, I don't think he should come back to reprise the role. I think it's time to pass down the mantle to a new performer, someone who could inject a new life into the character with a bit of youth and exuberance. Someone like David Howard Thornton, who has been an amazing Art the Clown, I think would be incredible as new incarnation of Freddy. Much like what Cody Leach said, I agree, man. Like, you definitely have to have an open mind about these things. If they do attempt another Elm Street, which they will, like, that franchise is gonna go on for a very long time. Whether or not there's gonna be, you know, years, decades between, you know, iterations, installments, reboots, TV series, you don't know. It's always interesting to see a new take on the character. We had somewhat of a new take with Dave McRae's interpretation in Dylan's New Nightmare, even though it's based on the New Nightmare Freddy. There's, you know, certain looks of different Freddys, you know, part 2, Demon Freddy injected in there, and Dave kind of doing his own thing at the same time, because you don't want to be a carbon copy of Robert, but you've also kind of have to have that link from New Nightmare, where obviously that is Robert as New Nightmare Freddy, or the entity portraying Freddy. So I definitely think it's open for interpretation. David Howard Thornton could be an interesting one. Like, he's definitely got the physicality, the mannerisms. He's a wonderful performer, given that the design and the makeup is on point, where you can take advantage of his performance. Like with that Art the Clown makeup, it's very simple, but they take advantage of that big grin, his eyes, everything. I think if you, like Jackie L. Haley, restrict the performance, that's when you've got a problem. Button-Eyed Decker. Freddy should have used other glove designs, something like the basement Freddy's Dead gloves at other points earlier in the series alongside his regular glove. Man, I love that sequence of when Maggie goes into the cellar and sees all the other gloves, like the prototype gloves. There's one with like hooks, there's one with just straight razors on the edge, and then you see the Part 6 glove in there, which is cool. It's a nice little tie into what glove he's using in that particular film. But I would love to see like a prototype glove, and you see like bits of pieces he was fiddling with in the first film when he's building the glove, and they were probably test pieces that Lou Carlucci and Charlie Blodnelli, who built the original glove, probably just had laying around there. Like, we just need to dump all this shit in a bag to make it look like he's like experimented at some point. But maybe again, like with Freddy's Dead, just a crude work glove with just razors like strapped to it. Like he doesn't have time, he just has to get his fix and like take that next victim with something that is crudely put together, and then finally he has the time to make the glove that we all know and love. Chris Diaz 8203. Freddy's Dead is fun and way better than Part 5 or the remake. I agree, sir. I unapologetically love Freddy's Dead because, again, I keep repeating myself ad nauseum. I equate it to Samurai Cop, The Room, just schlocky, so bad it's good. If you go into Freddy's Dead with that mindset, you're going to have a great time. But if you're looking at it through a very logical, critical lens, you're going to have a bad time, especially in comparison to Part 1 and Part 2. Just the Twin Peaks elements, how over the top and Roadrunner-esque Freddy is. And again, Robert said, we just felt it was okay to deconstruct and self-destruct at that point, because this was the last one. They're just like, fuck it, let's just go out with the goofiest bang ever. You know, Lisa Zane, Sean Greenblatt as John Doe, a kid with amnesia. All the kids in Elm Street and Springwood are now apparently dead, and just, look, it's so illogical that it just somehow works in the goofiest way possible. We got one from Frank Riker of the Slaughtered Lamb Movie Podcast. Hot take, Dream Child is a lot better than all the other movies except the first. So Frank, like me with Part 6, is a big fan of Part 5. He will defend it to the end of time. There are redeeming qualities in Part 5, especially when it comes to the kills, like Greta's kill, Dan's kill. Like, the effects work in that is brilliant. I do like the gothic aesthetic. Like, Stephen Hopkins went all out, went full European with the gargoyles, the blue tone of the film, just stuff like that. In terms of Freddy, he's not the greatest for me, but dude, if that's one of your favorites, that's amazing. Again, it definitely has redeeming qualities. I think some people are really coming around to it these days, which again, it's kind of like Part 2. Crimson Idol 92. The remake is not as bad as a lot of people think it is. Jackie L. Haley was an excellent Freddy. It was scary and not MTV/Freddy's Dead humor. Just need a better script, less on the molester part, and a certain casting of people who actually wanted to be there. If you're talking about Rooney Mara, I absolutely agree, man. She just did not embody the character of Nancy. And I'm not talking about Heather Langenkamp as Nancy. I'm talking about the characterization. Just, she sleptwalked through that performance and just did not want to be there. I didn't get heroine vibes from her at all. And I definitely think that this is a very scary Freddy. He's very serious. Like, yes, he cracks jokes now and then, but I love it when the dude's hanging upside down after he's like split him open. He's like, I'm paraphrasing, you know, the brain stays awake or, you know, alive for several minutes. And he's like, we've got several more minutes to play. I'm like, that is great. Like, that's a little bit of great writing there. And Jackie's delivery, even though it's stilted a bit from that makeup, it's still dark and fucked up, man. The Tar Man, Dream Master is one of the worst films of the franchise, particularly for killing the actually well-written characters from Dream Warriors, then funneling all their powers into the most bland, artificially planted new protagonist ever devised. Look, dude, to be honest, I'm not as big a fan as Dream Master as I was back in the day. And I get that because they killed Joey and Kincaid off so early in the film when they were so well written and well-rounded characters in Dream Warriors. I think out of all the teenagers in the franchise, Dream Warriors had the most well-rounded, believable, and likable cast of teenagers who banded together. That's what I really loved about Dream Warriors. You bought into the fact that these kids are terrified, but they all bring something different to the table. And to just kill the two of them off, you know, half an hour into the fourth film, like Rodney Eastman said, who portrayed Joey, just felt like a cheap trick. And the whole thing of Kristen passing on her power into Alice and, you know, you take my power and stuff like that. Well, the fourth film is entertaining. I definitely feel it does the third film a big disservice, and it's kind of all for nothing. Volga Beyond Steel says, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is better than 4. I agree. 100%. Like I said earlier on in this video, I place Elm Street 2 higher than Dream Warriors now. So, yes, I agree. General Hot Pizza 480. There's no good Elm Street movie. I'm going to need a bit more context. I'm going to need a bit more meat on the bone. So you're saying throughout the entire franchise, there is no good Elm Street movie. Not even something that's just, you know, it's okay. I mean, again, I need more context because holy shit, them's fighting words. CRM1299 says, is it a hot take to say that none of these movies are scary, but more just fun and funny? Is it just me or is that everyone? I love the franchise, by the way. The movies are classics and I watch them every year, but they're not scary. Maybe because compared to modern horror, e.g. Hereditary, they lose their scare factor. Yeah, I definitely think the more you watch these films, the more desensitized you get. Considering these days, like you said, Hereditary, where it's that psychological fucked up horror, but then we've got Terrifier 3, where it's this most extreme body horror ever. I don't find these films really scary anymore, but I absolutely love them, like you said. Part 1 and Part 2 to me, if I wouldn't call them scary now for me, they still are creepy. Like when I first watched them, yes, absolutely scary. Freddy's Dead was the first film I ever watched in the franchise, and I thought that was scary, but I was like, that big. But I had nothing to compare it to, and I worked my way back, and by the time I got to Part 1, I'm like, what the fuck is this? But I think, yeah, I still find enjoyment in all of them, but they haven't exactly aged where you're like, that scares the absolute shit out of me in comparison to, say, like Hereditary, The Witch, and hopefully this Thursday, Heretic. I got the premiere for that. I'm really looking forward to that one. Harley Bliss 6060. Hot take, Freddy's Dead is way more entertaining and enjoyable than Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Wes Crave in New Nightmare. Very good. I see what you did there. For me, I hated the new look of Freddy in New Nightmare. The burns are way off. Didn't even resemble the Freddy Krueger we all know and love. Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Like David Miller said with the makeup, it's not exactly a burn makeup. It's like his skin has split and it's showing all the anatomy and stuff like that. And like I said earlier on in this video, I would have loved to have seen the Part 1 Fred look in New Nightmare because it just makes sense because it's about the original cast from the first Elm Street. It's the 10th anniversary. Have that look. The sweater with no green stripes on the sleeves, you know, the Part 1 glove, even though this is the Part 2 glove. The original fedora, the makeup, but just more dilapidated and grotesque looking. Whilst I do think the shot of Freddy coming out of the bed, out of Dylan's bed in New Nightmare, and the shadowy cast like Nosferatu, that's all well and good. But when he's lit in the hospital about to kill Julie, it kind of kills the mood because he's too brightly lit. I need more dimly lit shots of Fred, and like the whole Truscian, you know, cave hell that he lives in, I would rather the boiler room over that any day of the week. And I feel like they should have incorporated the boiler room once again in New Nightmare. Whilst I definitely think it was way ahead of its time, and it's sad that it didn't do as well because it went up against Pulp Fiction when it first came out. It definitely like laid the foundations for Scream. But look, I definitely do find redeeming qualities in New Nightmare. I think it's smart. I think it's clever what they did. I definitely would have done things a lot different, especially when it came to the design of Freddy. Cheney! Freddy's Dead is a pretty good movie that lets you see how evil Freddy was, that he would kill his own wife because she knew what he does. Plus, very quotable. I agree on that one. That is it, like that flashback where you see all the gloves in the cellar with the padlock and everything, and Loretta comes out and says, I won't tell, and Fred says, we need to talk, Loretta. Then Maggie comes up as a little girl from the cellar and sees that, you know, Fred is snapping his wife's neck because he'd rather kill her than her know what he does. And that's dark. Like in another Fred film in another Elm Street film where the writing is a lot darker and it's not Freddy's dead. Like imagine that sequence as a flashback in part 1. Imagine how Wes Craven would have tackled that. But again, that's one of those little glimmers of darkness in Freddy's Dead that I love. And yes, plus very quotable. Very, very quotable. Like you got Freddy spewing lines as the Wicked Witch from Wizard of Oz, and then it's traveling time, great graphics, and
I beat my high score.
And there you go, guys. Those are some of your Nightmare on Elm Street hot takes. Some ripper ones in there, and that made for some damn good discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, otherwise we'd be here all day. But I'll definitely do another one down the track. So this coming week on Thursday, I've got the premiere of Heretic with Hugh Grant. Looking very forward to that. I have another beautiful glove unboxing from the man himself, Mr. Christian Carlson. There's going to be a very special one. You guys are definitely going to dig that one. And then next week, I can finally put my review up for Gladiator 2. I've got to film my review of that one before all the thoughts leave my little pea brain. But really excited to talk about that one. Love you guts, and I'll catch you in the next one.